and welcome to episode 20 of Sorastro's Marvel Crisis Protocol painting series. In this video, I'll be painting the Hulkbuster from Atomic Mass Games' Marvel Crisis Protocol. In the first part of the video, I'm going to share the way in which I like to prepare to paint a miniature like this, which often includes doing a little research and taking inspiration from the environment to help inform my colour choices. I'm then going to give a rundown of the colours and techniques I used to create the non-metallic metal effects for the three main tones on the figure. It's perhaps worth mentioning now that this is definitely quite a time-consuming technique, and you could certainly achieve a decent tabletop standard quite quickly by throwing some inks or contrast colours over a metallic base tone if you wish. I just like to stretch myself as a painter, and I do quite enjoy the challenge and expressive nature of working in the non-metallic metal style. In the last part of the video, I'll be applying a nice bit of weathering, and I'll be having some fun painting the blast effects, before adding a few final refinements. Let's begin. When choosing colours for a figure like this, I'll usually have a close look at a wide range of source material to give me some inspiration, which in this case includes the Marvel comics and movies. In the films, for example, we can see a couple of different Hulkbuster outfits. The Mark 44, pictured here on the left, which has quite a warm shade of red that leans towards orange, and the Mark 48, pictured on the right, which has a cooler tone, leaning more towards magenta. We don't have to be a slave to any single source, but I've decided I quite like the look of the cooler red for my Hulkbuster. I also like to take inspiration from the environment. These images, for example, which I snapped on my phone, can give us some useful information. Typically, shiny metallic surfaces like this will have a wide range of values, and I also like to observe how the light spills over the surface. Here in Photoshop, it's also quite interesting to observe the range of hues that we can see in the metalwork. I especially like how the reflection of the blue sky nudges these highlights here towards the cooler, more magenta range. Yet, as we get closer to the specular glints of the sun, the tone becomes notably warmer. I'm now reaching for some paints, and I've chosen to use the Scalecolor artist range, which I kickstarted a couple of years ago. I'll talk more about what I enjoy about these paints as we go, but you could of course use whatever paint range you like. When exploring new colours and ideas, I'll usually have some fun freely playing around with different tones and techniques on some spare plastic, until I have an approach that gives me the look that I'm after. When assembling the Hulkbuster, I initially chose to keep most of the limbs separate from the torso to make things easier to paint. And after priming the parts in black, I'm now just providing some gentle zenithal highlights with Vallejo's Cold Grey. This is mainly just to help me see the volumes and details a little more clearly, however, and won't have any real impact on the final look of the piece. Finally, I decided to test my colours out on the left leg to ensure that I'm happy with my approach before moving on to the rest of the figure. Let's now have a look at the colours and techniques I chose to paint the non-metallic metal. Due to the fact that I jumped around quite a bit between the different colours and parts of the figure whilst painting, I've chosen not to present the process in a strictly chronological fashion as usual, but instead we'll be covering each of the three non-metallic colours separately, starting with the simplest, which was the steel-coloured areas, followed with the gold, and then the red. For the steel or silver-coloured areas, I'm going to create a bluish-grey base tone using a mix of black, white, and Prussian blue. You can see here how thick and creamy these paints are out of the tube, and they can of course be thinned down to whatever consistency you like, making them quite a versatile product. It's a good idea to have some source images readily to hand if you're unsure which parts are meant to be which colour, and the rotatable images on the Atomic Mass Games website can be a big help here. For the highlights, I'm mainly going to be adding increasing amounts of vanilla white to introduce a bit of warmth. Most of these areas are pretty small, so there's not much room to play with variations of tone or texture. The largest section is probably here around the lower back, where I'm creating some vertical bands of highlight to add interest. I'm mostly imagining the light coming from above in a zenithal fashion, but also imagine some light coming up from the blast beneath. These are some of my last few highlights, where you can see I'm picking out the sharpest edges and corners. Moving on to the areas of gold, I'm starting with some raw sienna, which I'm darkening with a little black. I might also add a little purple to help set up some complementary contrast with the yellowish highlights I'll be adding in a while. A couple of layers might be needed if the tone feels a little thin. For the highlights, I'm going to initially use some pure raw sienna to create quite a rich mid-tone, before lightening things up with some Naples Yellow, Vanilla Yellow and Vanilla White. Interestingly, I found the raw sienna to be a little on the translucent side, and the lighter colours tend to be a lot more opaque. For these larger areas, I'll be playing with some irregular patterns and textures to add interest. And here for the face, I'd like to create some radial strips of highlight. This is pure vanilla yellow, and for small glinting highlights like this, I like to keep the paint pretty thick. Here I'm backing up to an intermediate tone to refine the transitions on the face. And I'm continuing to play quite freely with the texture on the forearms, where I want a somewhat battle-damaged appearance inspired by the movies. I'm now highlighting up to vanilla white for the brightest glints. Here I've chosen to mix in a little red to tint some of the areas that might pick up some cast from the surrounding armour. I'm applying this quite thinly to provide a gentle tint. And here I'm trying some more scratchy and stippled textures for the arms. We can also push the depth in the shadows to maximise the contrast. I'm now finishing off the face with a little red tint on the left side near the shoulder pad. Before moving on to the red, here's how I painted the various blue lights on the model. I started by applying an undercoat of pure white, along with a small boost to some of the surrounding highlights. And then simply applying some thinned fluorescent blue by Scalecolor on top. I've thinned this down quite a bit for the eyes and applied it in a couple of layers, soaking up the excess as I go. Notice how nicely the dark strip of gold helps the right eye to stand out. If things turn out a little dark, we can reapply a touch of white into the centre of the light. For the red armour, I've chosen to use a mix of primary red and the cooler crimson for my main midtone, which I'm first darkening down with a little black for the base tone. For a warmer red, you could just use the primary red, or indeed whatever basic red tone you like, and leave out the crimson. I've thinned this down just enough to allow me to achieve smooth, even coverage. For most of these areas, I ended up applying a second layer. I'm then going to highlight up to a mid-tone mix of the crimson and primary red. Then for the brighter highlights, I'll be adding varying amounts of vanilla yellow, vanilla white, and maybe some white. For a cooler look in some of the highlights on the upper parts of the model especially, I'll also be using some magenta, leading into some warmer, glinting highlights like we saw on the motorbike earlier. I actually ended up jumping quite quickly to the crimson and primary red midtone. Here on the head, I'm once again planning some quite strong radial highlights. I'm now mixing in some of the vanilla yellow to begin building up to the brighter highlights, and will initially be focusing on the right leg. If you're using paints by Vallejo, then colours like light yellow, ice yellow, and ivory would be fine here. Another approach here might be to sketch in some bright highlights right away, and then blend in some intermediate tones to smooth out the transitions. For some of the broader areas of light and shade, I might thin the paint down to a heavy glaze to help smooth things over. One of the things I like about these paints is how far they can be thinned before the pigments break down. Here I'm going brighter still with the addition of some vanilla white, and I'm once again struck by how opaque these lighter tones are, making them ideal for placing strong highlights like this. If you end up with broad areas that appear too pink or desaturated, you can simply apply some thinned red on top. I'm now moving around the rest of the armour in the same way. Here I'm now introducing some of the magenta, especially for the head, shoulders and chest area, where I want to create the most interest. I'm applying this somewhat thinly to play around with some gentle tints. Elsewhere I might glaze in more of the reddish tones to balance things out or increase the saturation. I spent quite a while going back and forth on the chest area trying to create some interest, although I think a fairly flat tone here would also look fine. I'm using mostly quite thin layers here to allow me to rework things if I don't like where it's heading, but also to help achieve some fairly gentle modulations of tone. Here I'm going a little warmer for some of the brighter highlights. I'm now focusing on the head, adding some quite concentrated spots of light, as this is where I want the most contrast to draw the eye of the viewer. I'm now moving over the rest of the armour, making adjustments to the levels of value and saturation until I'm pleased with the overall sense of volume. Once fully assembled, I'm keen to ensure that I'm happy with the overall balance, and I ended up toning down some of the highlights on places like the left leg, which I want to appear a bit more shadowed. And I really pushed the glinting highlights around the head and shoulders, which I want to be more of a focal point. Once again, you can see me using a combination of thinned layers to adjust some of the tones and saturation, and thicker layers for adding the strong, glinting highlights. With the metallics more or less complete, we're now ready to add some finishing touches. I'm now going to add some battle damage and weathering, and I'm starting with a mix of black and anthracite grey, which I'm using to add quite a prominent scorch mark to the chest. I'm then using a bluish off-white from the palette to draw in a scratch mark showing the exposed metal underneath. I'm now adding a few random dirt patches using some brown tones. Next I'm adding some chipping to the edges of the armour, once again using some off-whites from the palette. And I'm now freely playing with these various elements, keeping the marks quite small to help sell the sense of scale. To paint the blast coming from the feet, I'm first using the airbrush to clean the area up with some pure white. I'm then tinting the upper part of the blast with some thinned processed cyan ink, and pretty much any mid to light blue colour would be fine here. And for the lower part, I'm thinning some fluorescent yellow mixed with a little red. I've now slightly increased the amount of fluorescent red in the mix for the lowest part of the blast. After doing a bit of tidying up where I oversprayed a little onto the feet, I'm now mixing some bluish grey tones using the matte Scalecolor line, and using this to paint the smoke with a combination of sponge and brush. As with similar examples shown in the series, I'm avoiding the innermost parts of the blast. Here I'm just increasing the saturation with some fluorescent red. I'm now painting the base using graphite and a light dry brush. And here I'm just playing with some small particle-like textures on the blast. We can then add a little scatter to the base, including some twisting newspapers, as detailed in the Ghost Rider episode. These are now my last few finishing touches and refinements. And this completes Hulkbuster. Thank you for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed the episode. As always, you can find a full product list in the video description, along with links to all of the places I can be found online, including Sorastro.com, where you can find a range of free PDF guides to complement the videos. My sincerest thanks go to my kind patrons for funding this series, as I really couldn't do this without them. Join me again soon as we continue painting miniatures from Marvel Crisis Protocol. Happy painting!